I don't know of anybody in the War of 1812 who saw more action than Norton.
Yeah.
When you look at all the battles, all the skirmishes, the many months of the blockade of Fort George, nobody comes to mind who fought more than he did.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Stories of 1812 podcast. This is a series in which we focus on the lives uh, and the deeds of individual characters in the War of 1812 and why we need to remember them, why they are notable figures for us to remember today. And today we have a great guest coming to us from Toronto. His name is Carl Benn. He is a professor, at least now he is a professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. I don't think we're allowed to mention the former name. Are we allowed to mention the
Well,
former
the
name?
former name is easier to pronounce.
Yeah. Ryerson. And Carl has written extensively on the War of 1812, and in particular, the role of Indigenous figures, both Canadian, both American. And today we're going to look at John Norton. John Norton, just to give an overview, um, he was a chief and a diplomatic figure um, during the War of 1812 and before the War of 1812 on the Grand River for the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee. And his role, in particular, we're going to focus on his role on the War of 1812. Just to mention as well, we'll feature this when we do the show notes. You've written about 6 books, and one of those is on John Norton. And I guess that's the focus of our talk today. So,
Right.
welcome, Carl.
Thank
Welcome.
you. Pleasure to be here.
Um, how do we start with Norton? I was thinking, well, we'll do an overview, but I think we need to mention that he wasn't born in North America and he was raised, at least the early part of his life, in Scotland. I think we need to say that, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
his early life is complicated,
Yeah.
and it's become more complicated because a autobiographical statement he wrote in 1809 just came to light very recently,
Oh, well.
Library and Archives Canada.
Mm.
So his father was a Cherokee from South Carolina, and in the Anglo-Cherokee War in the beginning of the 1760s, British troops raided his village. Most people escaped, but somehow he was left behind, and he was burnt when the soldiers burned down the village.
Hmm.
He was injured, and a British Army officer took him under his wing to care for him. And so John Norton's father, who's also John Norton, ended up in the British Army
Right.
in Europe, and he met a Scottish woman, Christian Anderson,
Hmm.
the daughter of a farmer, but a family that was actually reasonably well connected into Edinburgh literary and legal circles. And they came together, and our John Norton, was born in 1770 in or near Crail, Scotland,
Hmm.
which is northeast of Edinburgh.
Oh, wow.
And then what happened was eventually, I'm not going to go into the details, but eventually, two Norton men ended up in the 65th Regiment, posted to Canada. And whilst here, they both left the army. John Norton Sr. deserted, went back to the Cherokees.
Oh, right. Okay.
And John Norton Jr. Uh, also deserted, but was captured, court martialed, but not flogged because he was very young. And his mom arranged to have him um, discharged from the army. And his mom planned to take him back to Europe, but she died. So Norton went off into the indigenous world of the lower Great Lakes, where he stayed until the 1820s before moving south into the um, uh, back into the Cherokee world.
Yeah. There's just one thing about Scotland that I wanted to ask you because it stuck out when I was reading. He had to be a he had to have been reasonably well schooled because his journal, flows. Unless that's not his original language, but the writing in his journal, which we'll talk about later, was very eloquent.
Well, he grew up learning English was his primary language, although we have some pretty clear indications his father taught him some Cherokee.
Mm.
Um, and he did go to school for a while in Scotland, but his father also took care to work on his education. His father had been um, trained by clergymen that the army officer arranged to educate him. So he had a bit of an education too.
Hmm.
Um, so they were literate, both of them.
And then, and then to pick up the story, thanks for that clarification. I think his early experience, he was a teacher for a while in the Bay of Quinte, which is near Kingston, right?
That's
Kingston,
right. What
Yeah,
happened was after he left the army,
yeah,
his mom took him to Quebec City to go back to Europe, but they had to spend the winter there.
right.
He had a job with a printer, but his mother died in the spring, and so John Norton fulfilled a long-term ambition to go into the Indigenous world, and he went to Bay of Quinte for a while, where he was a school teacher amongst the Mohawks of Tyendinaga.
But he didn't enjoy it. He didn't like it.
No, he didn't like
Yeah,
teaching,
yeah.
and he really wanted to go into the Ohio country where the Indigenous people were at war with the Americans. People forget there was a war on the Great Lakes frontier between the American Revolution and the War of 1812. It ran from,
Fallen timbers.
that's right,
Yeah,
1796 to
yeah,
1795.
yeah.
And the indigenous people of the Ohio country were trying to preserve their territories against American expansion. Um, the war lasted quite a few years. In 1791, on the Wabash, the entire U.S. Army was pretty well wiped out in one morning by an alliance of Western tribes, and Norton was at that battle.
Well, it was that fallen timbers.
No, that was in 1794,
Okay.
a battle that the Americans won that pretty much brought that war to an end and forced the indigenous people of the Ohio country to surrender a significant amount of territory in a treaty in 1795.
I want to catch up with you a bit. So he left. When did he leave the Bay of Quinte? You know, he didn't want to be a teacher.
But he,
1791, somewhere
yeah,
in
he left
there.
in 1791,
Okay.
and the Battle of the Wabash was in November 1791.
91. Okay.
And he actually provides an interesting description of the battle.
Yeah.
He doesn't mention himself in the battle, but when you compare what he wrote to what other eyewitnesses wrote, it aligns very well. And it's pretty clear he was in a largely Iroquois speaking column. There were
Wow.
sort of three columns of indigenous people attacked the American
Yeah.
forces. And uh, it's an overlooked part of Norton's journal that's quite fascinating.
Yeah, we're going to get back to that. We are going to talk about his journal. But I guess one other thing of note during that time, didn't he hook up with Tecumseh and some of the other leading figures
Um,
in the Indian movement in the
well, he was involved with the leadership of the Western tribes, and he worked as a translator in councils. He seemed to have a complete wonderful gift for picking up
Yes,
languages.
we should mention that. Yeah,
He met Tecumseh later,
yeah.
around 1810, but
His second trip. Yeah.
he met Joseph Brant, and Joseph Brant thought, this person could serve Six Nations interests. And after the Ohio War ended, Joseph Brant arranged for Norton to become a translator for the Indian Department
Department. But
at Niagara.
now, when did the Six Nations move to the Grand River Tract? Is that before or after when they were
It's
still
before
before? Okay.
1784 was when the
Yeah.
big move happened.
Right. Okay.
So Norton was in Niagara in
94.
1795 as a translator.
He'd come back working as a translator. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he worked for both the Six Nations and the Indian Department for a few years,
Right.
but then he left Niagara and moved to Grand River and um, severed his connection to the Indian Department for quite a while.
Well, that's something we'll have to come back on because there was a real there's a real conflict there, wasn't
Yes,
there?
there certainly
Yeah.
was.
Now, I think around this time, the issue of, and I think it's still an issue today, the Grand River Tract, the Haldeman Tract,
Right.
right?
Yes, it's
Um,
pretty complicated.
yeah,
So the Haldeman Tract was purchased by the Crown from the Mississaugas to resettle the Haudenosaunee refugees from the American Revolution on. And the geographic boundaries weren't well understood, but in 1783-84, the government thought it would be from the mouth of the river on Lake Erie up to its source, but they didn't really know where the source was.
Yeah. But
So
that's
that
in the deed, though, right? Those
that's right.
words. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And in subsequent years, the Indian Department officials in Canada um, shrank the size of the tract in their mind.
Yeah.
Um, Joseph Brant and John Norton and other modernizers within the Haudenosaunee world felt that there was actually more land than needed if the economy was going to switch to evolve to a more aggressively agricultural economy from what it already
Mm.
was, which they felt was necessary as settlers transformed the landscape. Other people in the Six Nations disagreed. They
Yeah.
wanted to keep the land and they wanted to preserve older life ways with more vigor than the modernizers thought possible. So there's quite a bit of tension on the Grand River. Another issue, though, is the Haldeman Tract was granted to the Haudenosaunee under the same conditions the Mohawks had held their lands in New York before the Revolution. And this is significant because in the 1763 Royal Proclamation, the government declared that Indigenous lands on the west side of the proclamation line could only be alienated to the Crown, not to individuals.
Yeah. The issue over sale.
Right.
Yeah.
However, the
Yeah.
Mohawk lands were on the east
East
side
side.
of the
Yeah.
proclamation line.
Yeah.
And so if you look at the grant, which says the land was to go to the Mohawks under the same conditions they had beforehand,
Mm.
it would seem to have exempted them from the restrictions of the Royal Proclamation.
Yeah.
However, government officials in Canada said no, because it gave them more control over the future of Six Nations
And
land.
I know it led to all kinds of conflict. Yeah.
And the
I,
other issue, too, was the government
yeah.
officials here were saying that because the Crown had purchased the land, the Six Nations only had occupancy rights, which
Mm.
were not as valuable as ownership rights. But the Haudenosaunee argued that they owned the land.
And it's on that point, don't want to get stuck, want people to send you emails for clarification. Um, Joseph Brant sends Norton to England, which turned out to be a very important trip, but ostensibly to appeal to the Privy Council.
That's right.
Yeah,
So Norton went to England for several reasons. One reason was to try and resolve the land dispute because the Haudenosaunee weren't getting anywhere with the Canadian officials.
yeah,
So Norton went to England. He was meeting prominent people in government and also people like William Wilberforce and other
yeah.
reform-minded people.
Robert Owen, the
Mm.
Clapham sect.
And he was doing well, and the
Yeah,
government was paying attention to him.
yeah,
Well, the Canadian officials didn't like that, and they held, frankly, an illegitimate council at Niagara to denounce the trip. And
and sent word of
and
that,
they
didn't
sent
they?
word to
Yeah,
England,
yeah,
and the government in England didn't quite understand Haudenosaunee politics, so they had to sever the connection with Norton.
yeah,
So that trip failed.
yeah.
Um, what gums it up, understanding this, is that people always think the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations of the Grand, were always unified in terms of how they responded to the
Yeah,
Lower
they have a
Boundary.
very unique form of decision making, which when I read your journal, I was trying to figure out, well, how do they ever make a decision?
Well,
You know? Yeah,
politics was focused largely on trying to achieve consensus,
yeah,
but the community was divided to a range of parties,
mm,
and the parties sometimes got to the brink of violence with each other, and each party had a small central group of people, and the bulk of the population moved around depending on their interpretation of what was best for the community to preserve its future.
mm,
Um, but when the British or the Canadian officials held this council in Niagara, they brought 60 native guys from the Buffalo Creek Reservation in Buffalo, New York,
yeah, yeah,
who had no legitimacy at that council.
yeah.
And in fact, they told the American commandant at Fort Niagara on their way over that the express purpose of the council was to break Captain Brant.
Wow.
So, the council was illegitimate, but the government in London didn't know.
Well, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about, and in the interest of time, um, about his involvement in the War of 1812. But just before that, very quickly, just to follow it chronologically, he took another trip to Cherokee country in 1809, which was about a year. And I guess uh, at that time we're very close to, you know, not Fallen Timbers. I always get them mixed up. The other seminal battle,
Tippecanoe.
Tippecanoe, right? So he's there just before the War of 1812, and it's unclear to me. You would know if he did fight with Tecumseh in the battle. It was unclear to me.
No, he
He
didn't.
did not. Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
he met Tecumseh on his way back from the Cherokee country,
Okay.
and he had a very high opinion of Tecumseh.
Hmm.
Um, he his trip is interesting because he knew something of his Cherokee ancestry
Yeah.
from his father, but his father was young when he left the Cherokee lands. We went back partly to cover the grave of his father with wampum, so we know the father got back.
Yeah.
And how do we know he actually intended to do that? Well, the missionaries down there wrote that.
All right.
And what we know from the missionaries is that Norton met his blood relatives.
Hmm.
They're clearly identifiable people. They have a history. We know them in the historical record. They describe Norton as half Indigenous.
Hmm.
Um, and it's interesting because he wrote about his trip there, and the the missionaries wrote about his trip there, and the two sources agree.
Oh, great.
Um,
If you're a historian, that's
yeah,
great. Yeah.
because a lot of people have tried to say that
Yeah.
Norton wasn't half Cherokee,
Yeah.
but they have to overlook
Yeah.
really solid historical data coming out of the Cherokee missionaries and the fact that Norton had blood relatives who are not vague people in the historical record, but clearly identifiable people.
So war is declared. Sorry if
Mhm.
I'm
That's
putting my
fine.
foot on the gas here.
Well, that's good.
War is declared June 1812.
Right.
And Norton is, and what well, sort of was a British soldier, and I guess he very much considered his loyalty to the crown. Tell us a little bit about how he got involved. Was it his connections with Brock? I know that he knew Brock and Brock met him. Brock went to the Six Nations, I think, on a recruiting drive in 1812.
Yes,
Yeah,
1812 was a difficult time for the Six Nations because, like everybody else around the Great Lakes, they assumed that the Americans would just conquer the province of Upper Canada
yeah,
easily because the demographics were so hopelessly lopsided in favor of the Americans.
yeah.
And there was no chance of Britain sending significant reinforcements here because of the war in Europe. In fact, why did the Americans not go to war in 1807, 8, 9, 10, and 11? Well, the British would have been better able to defend Canada. But 1812, things were pretty grim in Europe. Um, so most people at Six Nations decided they wanted to be neutral.
Hmm.
There was a small pro-American group. There was also a pro-British group, and the pro-British group was divided into those who wanted to take up arms and those who felt they really couldn't.
Hmm.
And Norton led the pro-British militant group, which at that time was very small.
Yeah,
However, after the fall of Mackinac and Detroit, and Brock pretty much convincing people that a successful defense was possible,
yeah.
then significant numbers of the Six Nations of the Grand came into the war as British
And it was
allies.
before Queenston Heights, which
That's
are
right.
probably also reinforced. So Norton is there, and tell us a little bit about the Battle of Queenston Heights and how he did that, you know, I don't even know how to say it,
Okay.
circumlocution.
So the
Yeah,
Americans came across from Lewiston, take the heights.
yeah.
They captured the heights. Um, British forces at the scene were numerically small,
Hmm.
so there was limited ability for them to stop the Americans. The British mustered troops from all up and down the Niagara River,
Hmm.
but of course, it took time to get there.
Yeah,
But they were able to keep the Americans out of the village of Queenston, for example. They were unable to retake the Heights, which, of course, was the event that saw Brock die.
yeah.
Um, but the Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous forces, largely led by Norton, with all the
Mhm.
subsidiary war chiefs commanding smaller parties,
Smaller groups, yeah.
um, came. down from Niagara on the lake, and then as they got towards the heights, they swung inland and climbed the heights out of range and out of sight of the
And
Americans.
there is a marker stone there. I
Right.
don't know if you've ever seen it down
No.
York Road. Yeah,
And
yeah,
what they were able to do, even though they're grotesquely outnumbered,
yes,
is they kept the Americans pinned down
yeah.
in a vulnerable spot on the edge of the heights, which gave the British forces time to muster the militia and the regulars on the heights to move against the Americans, who, by the time the British showed up, were expending a lot of their ammunition. They had been under fire for hours. Their morale collapsed. Their position was weak. And in 15 minutes after the British Army went into
The volley with Sheaf, right?
right, it was
Yeah,
over.
yeah, yeah.
And the British commander, Major General Roger Hale Shaffe,
Mhm.
acknowledged that the position taken by Norton and the Indigenous forces under him was absolutely critical to the success of the British victory.
I think I have a little note here. Sheaf. Uh, by the way, I've been told that it's Sheaf. I don't know. One of my guests said it was Sheaf.
Oh, I don't know. I always heard Shaffe, but it doesn't really matter.
Honored Norton by appointing him to the rank of captain of the Confederate Indians, and then Provost also, I think, ratified that. He got a promotion, didn't
Well,
he?
it was kind of more of an honorific because
Yeah,
it's up to the Six Nations to decide who their leaders are.
yeah.
However, before the earlier, Isaac Brock appointed him to the Indian Department as a captain.
Ah,
Now, Norton did fight as an Indigenous leader, not as a Indian Department official.
yeah.
But by being a captain in the Indian Department, that meant he had a salary, so he didn't have to worry about supporting himself, and also meant he had access to Indian Department supplies to supply his followers, because one of the marks of a indigenous leader at the time was their ability to supply their
To
followers.
give presents,
They give presents,
yeah,
to give largesse, to show generosity.
yeah, yeah. I'm trying to keep up the chronology, but there is a further point in there that I won't go. We'll come back to it. And then he was continued to be active, an active participant on the side of the British, either with varying sizes of warrior bands, or there's even a time where by himself he joined whoever it was, Murray, in December of 1813 when they crossed the river to take back Fort Niagara. So my impression is he was a consistent combatant. You know, Fort George, Chippawa, Lundy's Lane. He just kept on
Lots
fighting.
of skirmishes.
Yeah,
I don't know of anybody in the War of 1812 who saw more action than Norton.
yeah.
When you look at all the battles, all the skirmishes, the many months of the blockade of Fort George, nobody comes to mind who fought more than he did. But you're right about the size of his forces.
Yeah,
And this speaks to the fact that Six Nations and other people who came to accept his leadership in the Anishinaabe world, um, their views changed through the war as the um, strategic situation changed. But the Indian Department throughout the entire war tried to undermine him, and they did have a following within the Indigenous community. So, for example, Queenston Heights, he
yeah,
had a large force. At the beginning of the 1814 campaign, there were hundreds of warriors in his camp at Niagara.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
However, just before the Battle of Stoney Creek, he probably had 10 people with him.
Mm.
The number went up and down, but that's normal in terms of Indigenous military leadership at the
I'm
time.
glad you say that because as a an amateur historian, that always confused me. I mean, we're used to the British military. You have whatever you have. You have a regiment has so many people. You don't desert. The penalties are very severe. But the indigenous fought in a different way. And some of them had to leave. I think harvesting and family. Planting the harvest.
That's right, because the
Yeah,
warriors were only part-time warriors. They
yeah,
had family obligations and other obligations to fulfill. They also had the right to decide the level of their commitment into action. They even had the right to leave in the middle of the battle if they felt it was appropriate to do so. The there it was voluntary. It was consensus based. Um, it wasn't within the kind of disciplinary structures of European militaries. And also, there was the political politics of it. You know, when the British were in the ascendant, they were more likely to support the war
Yeah.
effort than when the Americans were in the ascendant.
One of the things of your your journal, we're going to talk, hopefully we have enough time to talk about your journal very quickly, was the dynamics of the decision making that I read right in
Right.
your book. And I really had difficulty getting my head around it because how do you make a decision like whatever we as Europeans we make a decision we all do it you know but they still allowed for people who didn't want to fight they didn't have to fight even though the council might decide the Six Nations Council to fight at this particular point in time.
Well, that's true. First of
Yeah.
all, the ideal was consensus,
Mm.
but often it's very difficult to achieve consensus with the different political factions or parties at Six Nations.
Mm.
So a consensus agreement usually would only encompass a part of the community. Um, but then once a consensus had been achieved, each individual would choose the degree to which they would commit to the
Okay.
consensus.
Yeah.
And that was their right, that was their
Yeah.
freedom. It was a
Yeah.
society with considerably more freedom
Mhm.
um, in personal choice than existed in European and North American settler society.
Yeah.
Now, there were constraints because there was a sense that division was a weakening of a community, not just temporally, but spiritually. There was also pressure. You know, if your influential people in your family were arguing for a particular course of action, it would take a bit more effort to disagree with them.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so, so there are all kinds of factors in terms of people's choices,
Yeah.
and there were some constraints, but nothing like in European society.
Yeah. So, end of the war, near the end of the war, Battle of Chippawa. And then there's a real, I guess, difference of opinion within the Six Nations because the Americans had, is it Senecas and Tuscaroras fighting with them?
And other people too.
Yeah.
Yes, the we always forget that there was the majority of Haudenosaunee people in 1812 lived in the United States,
Oh, okay.
and a significant number of them um, served alongside American forces at the beginning of the 1814 campaign. And at Chippewa, uh, both American Allied and British Allied Haudenosaunee came into action against each other.
So Red Jacket wanted to quit. He was the,
An American
yeah, leader.
Seneca leader, but so did a lot of other people. And there was a council after the battle in which the uh, two Haudenosaunee populations came to a consensus that they would leave the war. And for the most part, they did.
Yeah.
Norton was an exception. He and a small band continued fighting right to the very end.
And he was at Lundy's Lane, but he had a handful of warriors with him, I
That's right.
think.
And he was
Yeah.
at the blockade or siege of Fort
Fort
Erie.
Erie at
Um,
the end.
Now,
Yeah.
the exception is when the Americans threatened Grand River directly. The people of Grand River, of course, mustered to defend their community, and the British sent reinforcements from the Niagara River to bolster their strength.
Yeah.
People forget that, and there was some fighting along the boundaries of the Grand River late in
Which it
1814.
was MacArthur. What was the American?
MacArthur,
Yeah.
Duncan
Yeah.
MacArthur,
Yeah.
he led basically a raid along the north shore of Lake Erie, destroying mills and whatever else he could to
Yeah.
reduce British ability to feed their troops. And the intention was to take Grand River and then swing down into the Niagara River. But at Grand River, he was stopped and withdrew back to the Detroit area.
Well, we have, so much to talk about, and I just want to be careful of time. And there's about three more things I want to talk
Good
about.
heavens.
But can we talk about the journal for a moment?
Yes, the
Because
journal.
it's it's a piece of, I would say, valuable ethnography. We learned so much about the Cherokee and their civilization,
It's
maybe
a
others.
magnificently important text.
Yeah,
And it's far and away the longest, most detailed Indigenous authored text of that period and of any period leading up to it. And it has several components. Um, One of it is a long history of the Six Nations, as Joseph Brant and John Norton and their community understood it.
understood it.
And it's interesting because when you look at their sources, part of it's oral tradition, part of it's living memory, and
Yeah.
part of it's the use of European histories.
Yes, he
uh,
used what's his name, Heriot or somebody in the
and the
Canadian
French
French.
authors of this
Yeah,
of the earlier period.
period. Yeah.
Now, it's possible that that part of the journal was written in part by Joseph Brant,
Mhm.
or that John Norton used an earlier text that Joseph Brant wrote. And I say this for two reasons. One reason is we know that Joseph Brant was writing History of the Six Nations. It's lost. And two, when you read that part of the journal, the literary character is a little different than the rest of the journal. So I think the hand of Joseph Brant is in there. Another part of the journal is John Norton's trip to the Cherokees.
Yes.
And uh, not only does it tell us a lot about the
In
Cherokees at the time,
1809, just for our
1809-10,
listeners. Yeah, yeah,
but also tells us a lot about what the world of settler society was like between Upper
yeah,
Canada and the Cherokee country.
yeah,
He also talks about the Frontier War in the third person, even though he was in it. And then, of course, we have his adventures in the War of 1812.
yeah.
And his memoir of the War of 1812 is right at the very top end of the very best memoirs in the
Well,
world.
I think I mean, it's rich reading because it's personal experience, but I just want to say, I've read it and we have to make a plug here because without your footnotes, we lose the chronology and we lose the facts of the situation. So, thank you for doing all those annotations.
Yeah, so it took a long time. And after
Yeah,
doing that, I said to myself, I'm never going to annotate again. It takes so much work compared to writing just your own book from
yeah,
scratch.
yeah,
But Norton's text needed help to be comprehensible to 21st century audiences.
yeah.
I know he will allude to something that nobody would understand, so I had to track it down and explain it. And
It's a wonderful treasure because, it was in it was in the hereditary library of the Duke of Northumberland, which is one of his friends that, he befriended.
mhm,
And it wasn't published, and the whole thing wasn't published until 1970
that's right.
by Clink and Tallman. And then I guess you got the War of 1812 portion and
That's right.
took that further.
Klink and
Yeah,
Tallman, Carl Klink and J.J. Tallman
yeah,
edited the entire journal,
yeah.
important text, but they edited it quite lightly.
Mm,
Whereas I took out his 1812 memoir and not edited, annotated it very heavily
yeah.
to make the most sense out of it, to make it most useful. Somebody needs to take the history of the Six Nations and do a really detailed exegesis of it.
Yeah.
Not going to be me, but it needs to be done. It needs to be done someone with high end expertise in
Well,
the subject.
hopefully, some of our listeners are hearing this or viewers, and they will they will be in touch.
I hope so. Give me a call.
We just want to close with, Norton's final days. And for me, as a lay reader, I'm a little hazy. I know his wife was unfaithful and he had a duel, and the opponent, I can't remember his name, what
Big
was
Arrow or Joe
Big
Crawford.
Arrow, yeah, was expelled from the Six Nations.
Mm.
He didn't want to. He said he'd stand trial. It was a minimal fine, and then he left again.
Yes, what
Yeah,
it's so after the War of 1812, he went back to England,
yeah.
and this time he got the British government to tell the Canadian officials to um, correct the Six Nations land tenure
Mhm.
in their favor, but they used the fact that they were 3,000 miles away from England and bureaucratic intransigence and divisions of Six Nations to prevent that from happening. Norton continued the Six Nations till 1823 when he fought this sort of rough kind of duel with Joe Crawford over his wife's
Was a
honor.
scuffle or something.
Well,
No?
it was a duel, but it was pretty rough and ready, kind of.
Yeah, yeah,
And so both their lives were endangered.
yeah.
Both were wounded. Norton in the head, Crawford in the leg, but Crawford succumbed to the wounds.
Mhm.
They could have gone through Indigenous justice, and as John Norton's son told him to do that, but he chose to use European justice, and he was fined £25 from
Right.
manslaughter, which
Yeah,
was a bit light.
yeah.
And then he left. He went back to the Cherokees,
Right.
and he was running around down in Arkansas, Tennessee. He was down in Mexican territory helping the Shawnees from the Ohio country who were seeking
Oh, right.
refuge in Mexican
Well, what was
territory.
then Mexican territory,
Then
maybe?
Mexican
Yeah,
territory.
yeah.
The Americans later, grabbed it. Um,
How do we know when he died? There's talk of a letter that was written by a friend of his.
okay, so in
Yeah,
1826, he
yeah,
wrote that he was coming home, but he
yeah,
didn't come home.
yeah,
And then what we have is letters from Cherokee missionaries, the Moravian missionaries, where one of them from the Brainerd Mission, which was in Tennessee, wrote to missionaries at the Dwight Mission, which was in Arkansas, and said, um, John Norton died last winter. So he died in
Okay.
1827,
Yeah,
and doesn't really say anything more than that.
yeah,
So I think we cannot assume that he died of natural causes. Um, Now, his father and his son both died in their late 50s, and Norton was in his late 50s. So there may have been,
yeah.
some sort of hereditary illness,
Well,
or who
this is
knows.
what is going to keep you going, right? Who knows? And maybe there's some obscure newspaper article somewhere that we'll find out.
I have looked high and low. I
Yeah,
spent over a year of my research time focusing just on Norton's identity.
yeah.
Um, and I'm doing other kinds of history now.
Well,
Um,
the mystery continues, as we say to our viewers,
mhm.
and I'm sorry we're going to have to end it there.
Okay.
But there's lots more to tell, I think, for people who want to pick up this book on Norton. We'll put it on our website, our show notes. Thank you so much, Carl, for coming. It's a fascinating subject. We could continue more, but we have to say goodbye for now. We'd like to thank Jim Valen of Valen Entertainment, who's behind the controls here today. For more information, please go to our website, www.storiesof1812.com. There'll be lots of information on Carl and his books. And we will see you next time. Thank you for joining us.